Hello everyone. Thank you for coming to our event today. My name is Momin and I'm the president of the PAKSOC. And I would like to introduce you to our new vision for the society. PAKSOC has always been known for doing great clubbing nights and great cultural events and going to Winter Wonderland and God knows what else. But today we really want to use the best and most capable people of Pakistan and beyond to try and put Pakistan on the page, to discuss some of the issues that we as Pakistanis face, to discuss the issues that are taking place back home. And the point of this is to really demonstrate how we can improve Pakistan. And we believe that's through dialogue and through discussion, and by using the collective minds we have in LSE, in Queen Mary, from Oxford and beyond, to really try and change the narrative on Pakistan and develop the thoughts that we have in depth. So this was the idea that we had, and thank you to my committee and everyone involved. We've been able to make it happen, and we will try to provide you with the best thoughts that we have today, and I'll let you listen to what we have to say, and I would like to pass it on to Dr. Sarkar, who is chairing for us today. He's from the South Asia Center, and he has given up his important time to be with us today to really push the page forward on Pakistan. A big clap for him.
Thank you very much. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar, and I am the Deputy Director of the South Asia Center here at the London School of Economics. Let me begin with saying I have no role to play in today's debate. All of you are the judges. I am here simply as overseer, and I wish to play no role in the judgment, but I would only implore all of you to listen not just to what is being said, and listen to it carefully, but listen to the implications of what is being said. And when you have the second round of voting, decide how you're going to vote. Okay. The South Asia Center, we encourage all of you to visit our website. It was set up in 2015. I joined in 2014. I was at King's before that. And one of the things that we did at the South Asia Center was that we realized very quickly that if we want to make our presence felt in a competitive country like Britain, where there are so many South Asia centers, is to do something that is fundamentally different from what all other South Asia centers do, which is to try and create a level playing field for all countries in South Asia, and that, of course, included Pakistan. I will get to know more about all the speakers. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm looking forward very much to this. The only thing I have to say in my capacity as chair is to ensure to the speakers, first, all 6 of you, and then to all of you who will have the opportunity to question, that this is a free platform to exchange ideas and debate, as long as you ensure that the basic rules of free speech are followed. Please don't make any personal comments about anyone that is based on nationality, on gender, on sexuality, anything of that sort. Outside of that, I think I would encourage all of you to speak your mind, and all of you to speak your mind when you ask your questions. I promise not to ask a question, but that doesn't mean I will not have questions. But that's the limitation of my position. Good luck to everyone. May the best team win.
Okay, before moving on, I'd like everyone to please place their phone on silent. We don't want just a random ringing sound going off. And I'd like to introduce Hussein, our Activities Development Officer, and this could not have been done without him, so I'd like you all to give a big clap of hands to Hussein. Thank you.
Thank you, Momin. So as Momin said already, I'm currently the Development Officer of the Pakistan Society. So let me, before we go into the rules and regulations of how exactly this debate is going to work, let me talk a little bit more about the society and the vision that we have, given that this is our first academic event. So a lot of work has gone into not only this event, but additionally into planning the new trajectory of the society within its newfound academic capacity. And it's really as a part of this trajectory that we'll be implementing events throughout the Lent term that provide you with debates like this that realize the importance of shaping constructive discussions around Pakistan, not just holding discussions, but shaping discussions that are in some form constructive. And something that we were really looking forward to with holding debates like these was to discuss contentious topics that don't have the aim of stirring controversy, but do have the aim of stirring discussion and discourse. Because what we see currently within Pakistan is most of the mainstream discourse within the media, or even at the LSE with most conferences that are organized about Pakistan, is the issues are always focused on politics, economy, Kashmir, terrorism, and so on and so forth, and rightly so, because these are important issues which have lots of people that are affected by them. However, at the same time, as a society, we realize that while it's all good and well that the platforms exist to talk about these issues, there should also be topics such as the one before you today that are discussed explicitly, and topics that are not discussed openly back in Pakistan as they are over here. And it becomes that it's not only certain topics that are left out of the spotlight, but it's also certain individuals. You know, the setting we have before you today, bringing 6 speakers together, diverse in backgrounds, their experiences, some Muslim, some not, some British Pakistani, some not, some that grew up in Pakistan, others that didn't grow up in Pakistan. You know, these are individuals that you wouldn't see debating and discussing topics like this, either alongside each other or against each other back home in Pakistan or a prominent university within Pakistan. And it's especially pertinent not only to have students here it's especially pertinent to have students at these events and at the center of discussions like this. And even at a time like this, when in a month's time, we have the 35th anniversary coming up of the archaic ban on student unions within Pakistan, a ban that has stifled potentially generations of fully open and honest discussions like these within university campuses back in Pakistan. And so it is with this, and hopefully, you know, many more academic events to come, that we signal a new vision of the society, one that realizes the importance of having at least, if not back home, at least here, open and honest discussions surrounding Pakistan at the LSE instead. It is therefore with that very sentiment, we once again welcome everyone to the first inaugural debate of the LSESU Pakistan Society Debate Series. So moving on now to the debate that we have in hand, as you can see, the motion is, this House believes that without Islam there is no Pakistani identity. Before we proceed with the rules of the debate, let me first announce the speakers that we will be having participating in the debate today. Starting off with the proposition side, the first speaker we have Daniel Farooq. Daniel has delivered khutbahs at Oxford University and talks for the Oxford Islamic Society, as well as having chaired and organized an event on the plight of the Uyghur Muslims. He is an experienced public speaker as an influential member of the prestigious Oxford Union, winning prizes for his speeches on topical debates. Additionally, at the Oxford Pakistan Society and South Asian Society, he has spoken at large debates and events on contemporary issues. Daniel is also involved with the Oxford Student Action for Refugees and the Oxford Homeless Project, working to make a difference in the local community. He is an ambassador and bursary recipient of the Royal Television Society and Moritz Hyman Scholar. For second speaker, we have Akmal Rafiq. Despite being born and bred in the UK, Akmal has said he has always felt more Pakistani than British. However, as he has grown up, he has begun to question his own identity and what it really means to be Pakistani. He has felt a growing disconnect between what he perceived the sense of nationalism to be and his own beliefs, and found it conflicting when it came to things like culture and religion. He said this event would provide him with an opportunity to voice his concerns and be able to debate them with others. For third speaker of the proposition, we have Barira Bullo. Barira is a first-year student at the LSE who holds a keen interest on issues prevalent within Pakistan, and in particular those that encompass topics of historical perspectives in government. She is an undergraduate representative for the Debate Society here at the LSE and has participated in over 7 competitions, winning the recent London Open Pro-Am final, and is looking forward to debating her first Pakistan-related motion. For opposition, first speaker, we have Mustafain Kamal. Having been involved in several projects that aim to document the stories of partition, Mustafain has always thought that we should honor the sacrifice of these people by preserving the ideal they fought for. Sadly, he believes that the ideal is distant from the reality of Pakistan today. Having been on the Oxford Union Committee and represented both Oxford and the LSE here, recently even the South Asia debate that we had, at various speaking competitions has allowed him the chance to debate issues related to South Asia at various forums. For the second speaker, we have Sadia Sajid. Being told countless stories about the 1947 partition, from both her parents is where Sadia's interest in this debate stems from. Sadia enjoys reading and the relationship between the state and religion, and concepts such as nationalism and identity politics. She has also previously made it to the final of the London Open and the LSE Women's Open as part of the LSE Debate Society, and was ranked in the top 5 novice speakers in both competitions. This evening captures the two things Sadia cares about most, Pakistan and debating. Last but not least, we have Mr. Hugo Chima Grubb. Hugo is a second-year history student at Queen Mary College, University of London. He loves politics and debating, whether in or outside of society meetings, and has therefore trained extensively against the finest orators of QM's local Wetherspoons. Having grown up in London, Hugo enjoys fencing and sailing whenever he gets the time. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to announce the proposition and opposition side for the debate today. Moving on to the rules of the debate. So the debate will roughly follow an Oxford Union style format. Speakers will be first called upon by the moderator, i.e. me, with the first speaker of the proposition beginning with their respective speech, followed then by the first speaker of the opposition, and so on and so forth. The debate will consist of 7-minute speeches each. The first and last minute of the speech will be considered as protected time. This is time during which no points of information can be offered by either side. The 5 minutes in between, however, are open to points of information from either side. These can be phrased as a short question or statement, should be ideally kept concise so as to not take up the speaker's time excessively. Speakers can either choose to reject or accept points of information that are offered to them. So once the first minute is ended and also once the last minute has begun, I'll be signifying this by 1 knock on the table. Finally, once the speaker's time has ended, there will be 2 knocks on the table by me. Speakers are encouraged to wrap up their speeches in 30 seconds or less once the last knock has been delivered. After all speeches have been heard, we will be conducting a 30-minute question and answer session during which the audience is open to ask either side. I will also shortly be asking audience members to vote on whether they are for or against the motion. This vote will be conducted prior to the debate, as it is now, and also after speakers have concluded with their speeches. So just to explain the voting a bit, the side that has swung the greatest number of voters will have won. What that means is basically, let's say there's 70 votes for and 20 votes against before the debate starts. After that, let's say the composition has changed to 50 votes for, 40 votes against. That means 20 people have shifted side. So that means the opposition has won since they've managed to swing the largest number of voters. Before I proceed, however, with asking for a vote, let me first remind all attendees, both participants and audience, that the views expressed in this debate may not necessarily represent the beliefs of speakers and do not represent the view of the LSESU Pakistan Society. Additionally, while discussing these contentious topics stimulates debate, and all discourse, however, should be of a civil nature. The society is hoping to create with debates like this an environment in which criticism is delivered, yes, but criticism in a thoughtful and respectful manner, taking into account people's sensibilities and so on. Now, so let's conduct with the vote. So let me begin by first asking everyone who is in support of the motion, that is, agrees with the motion that we have today. This House believes that without Islam there is no Pakistani identity. Please raise up your hands so our committee members can tally up the votes. So in support of the motion, raise your hands up. And committee members, please tally up the votes. Please keep your hands up until my committee members are done. Okay, guys, please put your hands down. Please put your hands down. Excuse me. So now I'll be asking everyone who's against the motion, that is, does not agree with this motion, please raise your hands up so our committee members can tally up the motion. Please keep your hands up until my committee members are done. Okay, now, perfect. Guys, now let me please call upon the first speaker of the proposition to deliver a speech when ready. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. So this house believes that without Islam, Pakistan has no identity. I would like to start by defining what do we mean by identity? A nation's identity is made up of two broad components. Its policy. The state is defined based on the perception of its policies which stem from its institutions and laws. Secondly, its thoughts and emotions. Now in a natural state, these thoughts and emotions will be aligned with the thoughts and emotions the population holds. Now in an unnatural state, it will be the thoughts and emotions that are at odds with its population. When this occurs, there will be friction with either the population trying to correct the shape of the state's policies through protest or demonstrations, or the state could be trying to enforce thoughts and emotions on a population or people that don't agree with it. And this is something that we see similarly in Xinjiang or in the Arab Spring, for example. Now, it is the alignment between these two components that determines the degree of harmony that exists within society. So I'd like to make three main points tonight in proposition of this motion. Now, point number one, let's make no mistake that the thoughts and emotions of Pakistan is for Islam. 97% of the population is Muslim. And many events demonstrate that the sentiment of the people is Islamic, from the Khatm Nabuwat last year to protest for Rohingya. The sad reality is, though, that we need to make, especially in this first point, is that the political system, the institutions and laws are in fact un-Islamic. And they are implemented on a population despite being fundamentally against their beliefs. Corrupt, democratically elected leaders and dictators have been imposed, and a system has been enforced on a population which does not resonate with their beliefs. When we look at the problems that face Pakistan today, from immense poverty to rampant corruption to terrorism, it can only be attributed to this betrayal of the population by implementing these foreign systems of secularism, capitalism. And so the causes of the problems that we see in Pakistan today cannot be attributed to the population's identity of Islam. If we say we understand Islam, and if Islam is the Quran and the Sunnah, and we uphold this, we would understand extremism and violence from actually the results of secularism, nationalism, and the Western movements, not Islam. So any problems that the opposition would like to bring tonight and point towards the identity of Islam, it is not that it is in fact the lack of Islam on the political stage implemented by successive rulers and governments for the last 70 years. Now, let's go on to point number two. Islam is a comprehensive way of life. Now, if we have 97% of the population who believe in Islam, they hold a fundamental viewpoint on life. They have an aqidah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, and He is al-Hakim, the legislator. And no majority, no man-made idea can have authority ahead of the decree of Allah. It says in the Quran, in Surah Maida, verse 47, وَمَنْ لَا يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Whoever does not rule by what Allah has revealed are transgressors. So, this is so crucial. Ascribing any identity that gives sovereignty to man goes against the beliefs of the overwhelming majority of the population, and so would inevitably lead to contradiction. And due to the fallible nature of such ideas, coming from man, from the limited mind of mind, it would lead to turmoil, as we see across the world today. So Muslims cannot have these identities of nationalism or secularism, which directly contradicts their beliefs. In a hadith from Prophet ﷺ, he said, it is not one of us who calls for Asabiyah, or who fights for Asabiyah, or who dies for Asabiyah. So how can we talk about identities such as this as alternatives to the Islamic identity, when they cannot even share the same platform, as they fundamentally oppose each other? As we see on the streets, the Muslims will not accept these identities. They will protest, rightfully so, because it does not agree with their beliefs. And when the belief that the vast population hold is for Islam, there can be none of these nationalistic or secularistic identities, because Prophet ﷺ forbid it.
So, once one pronounces the Shahada, the profession of belief, then this overrules such identities, and there is a much stronger human bond that doesn't divide by these artificially drawn borders. The reality is that Islam is a comprehensive way of life that has solutions to all our problems, whether political, economic, or social, and this is shown throughout the centuries that Islam was actually implemented in the region. 25% of the world's GDP came from the region before the colonialists made every attempt to ensure and remove this system and make sure that it would never come again. And let's not forget that this was what our forefathers sacrificed their lives for in masses, for the return of a nation that ruled by Islam, the revival of this nation to rule by justice, as it was still in their living memory. And now this brings me to point number 3. And this is what Pakistan was created for by the forefathers. When the masses chanted, Pakistan ka matlab kya, la ilaha illallah. Now it is clear if we look in history, Allama Iqbal was one of the first with the idea of Pakistan's foolish dream, whilst India was under the control of the colonial British. And following a nationalistic India, he foresaw that there would be no place for Muslims, for their social, political, cultural identity. So he proposed the idea of Islam as a separate nation for Islam. He envisaged the Medina state. So concluding his prudential address at the All India Muslim League annual session at Allahabad, Iqbal said, "One lesson I have learned from the history of Muslims. In critical times in their history, it is Islam that has saved Muslims and not vice versa. If today you focus your vision on Islam and seek inspiration from the ever-vitalizing idea embodied in it, you will be only reassembling your scattered forces, regaining your lost integrity, and thereby saving yourself from total destruction." Iqbal explained his reasons for becoming involved in politics in his prudential address, delivered at the annual session of the All India Muslim Conference at Lahore in 1932. Politics have their root in the spiritual life of man. It is my belief that Islam is not a matter of private opinion, it is a society. Hence, it is clear that Allama Iqbal, who laid the founding principles of Pakistan, had done so with the objective to create a state founded by Islam for the Muslims. And there is a claim that Jinnah, the founding father of Pakistan, was secular and envisaged a secular state. But this is simply a false argument, disproven by history. Pakistan was only created for the name of Islam. Muhammad Jinnah said himself, "We must get Islam at any cost." And he ended in this speech, he said, "Pakistan, where Muslims will be able to offer the ideology of Islamic rule." And he said this in a public meeting on 24th of November. So in order to conclude... Sorry? Okay. It is in order to conclude that it's clear without Islam, Pakistan has no identity. And this is conclusively proven that this was what Pakistan was created for. And it is the only unifying factor that will unite the beliefs of the population. And so, it is Islam that has not been implemented and is still not implemented, and it is only the return of this identity on all spheres of life that will grant the solution to the problems. And it is not a dream, because Prophet ﷺ promised it himself. And I therefore urge you to vote for a proposition of this motion, as it is not only Islam the only identity of Pakistan, but its implementation as the only solution to the current problems Pakistan faces. Thank you very much.
So a few point of orders from the speech. I remind speakers that firstly, during the last minute, no points of information can be offered, and secondly, speeches should be wrapped up in 30 seconds or less after 2 minutes is gone. Can I call upon the first speaker of the opposition, please, to deliver a speech when ready?
So, frankly, I'm very disappointed in the way that the debate has been framed, and this is for a couple of reasons. The first being, the framing agrees with two parties that I never think that I'd like to be associated with. The first is the Western media. They've also portrayed Pakistan as a monolithic country which doesnn't have diversity, which doesn't have vibrancy, and there's no room for other religions or cultures. The second group that I really don't want to be associated with are those who say that there is only room for Muslims in Pakistan. And of course, if we did live up to the ideal of an Islamic nation, there would be room for everyone, as I will portray in my speech. But the logical fallacy that the proposition is supporting really unfolds. They presented one option that they have, the first being that Pakistan is not Muslim enough. If Pakistan was more Muslim, then there would be pluralism, and I'll draw on that later. The second option they have is that Pakistan is too Muslim. They're saying that the only idea of an identity associated with Pakistan is that of a Sunni Islam, and that's crowded out room for everything else. And what we need to realize is that the truth really lies in the middle. Of course, there's been a domination. I'm not going to deny that there's been discrimination of minorities. But what we need to realize is that domination does not mean extinction, and it's our job to actually support those minority groups in bolstering their identity rather than suppressing it like the proposition has. So let me outline the arguments I'm going to make. The first is the concept of an Islamic republic. Like the first speaker so eloquently outlined, if we were to have an Islamic republic, what would that mean? And I'm going to draw examples from our history. The second example is, what did Jinnah actually envision? And why are we having this debate today? And the final point are about policies that are being implemented in current day Pakistan, which sort of put support our side of the argument. So, when we look at Pakistan and we look at Islam in the subcontinent, where did it originate from? So the brief history is that a bunch of Iranian invaders came to the subcontinent and started ruling over the subcontinent. Now you'll notice, as often is picked out in the Indian media, that the majority population of the subcontinent remains Hindu. And why is that? It is because the brand of Islam that was imported to the subcontinent was divergent from the ardent one of the Arabian Peninsula, namely Sufism. And we've heard excerpts from Allama Iqbal. And of course, the famous quote of his is that Urdu is sweet, but Persian is sweeter. And that was a direct allusion to the Sufi shrines that he used to visit, in which pluralism was upheld. So there are lots of examples throughout Mughal history, which is essentially where we do get Islam in the subcontinent, notably Akbar, where he sort of even infused two religions together, where he brought Hinduism and Islam together. And I'm not saying that that's the current state of Pakistan, but to quote Shashi Tharoor, we really need to know where we've come from to comment on where we're going. Now, the second example, on a much more micro level and bringing it up to date, is the case of the Hindu caretaker of the Pakistani National Museum in Karachi. Now, if anyone's been to Karachi recently or seen the ARY articles, there's a Hindu caretaker in the National Museum of Pakistan, and his dad actually had the job before him. So I actually went there this time in Christmas, and I asked him what he was doing, and he was actually putting up pictures of politicians who had recently won the elections and taking down pictures of politicians that had won the previous election. So I ask you, who is more Pakistani, someone who has devoted their entire life to the preservation of its culture, or those heinous politicians who are asking him to do such a ridiculous thing? Now, Sadia will more eloquently than I draw on the literature and the culture that's been put forward by non-Muslims in Pakistan. Just to give you a brief example, Monto has been celebrated very recently, and of course we shouldn't say that he's Muslim just because he was born into a Muslim family. He was a devout Marxist, devout atheist. Are we going to discredit his literature just because we would prefer if he was Muslim? I don't think so. The second is the idea of Pakistan. Now, of course, we're having this debate because there are so many ideas about the idea of Pakistan. And both sides, whether they're pro-Islamic identity or they're pro-secularism, draw on Jinnah. So we heard a quote from a particular speech of Jinnah's. I will draw a quote from the same speech in which he said that you're free to go to your temples, to your churches. Of course, it's a very famous quote. Now, supporters of secularism will say that that means that he wanted a secular state. I'll concede that the truth is more nuanced than that, but what it does mean is that there is room for non-Sunni Muslims within Pakistan, and that should be acknowledged. Now, to draw on the example of Jinnah himself, who was quoted by the first speaker, he was actually born into an Ismaili family, and then he converted into a different brand of Shiaism later in life. Now, there was a court case in 1984 in Pakistan which actually made it illegal to revise this history, because it appeared that a lot of Pakistanis after partition would have preferred if Jinnah was a sanitized Sunni Muslim. But that's, of course, against history and against the facts. So we really do need to know where we're coming from. So what was it that Jinnah wanted out of Pakistan? And I would say that the primary focus was refuge. We wanted an equal voice, an equal say, and an independent nation after independence from the British. We didn't want British Raj to be replaced by Ram Raj. And of course, I think that signified no more than the best example of this, which was the fact that Jinnah's first law minister was a Hindu. And he was a Dalit from the lowest caste. And of course, they had a very similar story to what the Muslims had at that time in India, where they were discriminated against a Congress which was dominated by Brahmins who were upper caste Hindus. And of course, Gandhi alienated himself from this group. So even the law minister, or the first ever law minister of Pakistan, was saying that I would rather be in an independent Pakistan than a Hindu India, because I think that I will seek refuge here. Now third, you may say that all the points that I've made are so historical, and yes, they're wonderful in theory, but look at the practice today. Sunni Islam is clearly dominant. Now, I want you to just to compare the trajectories that are occurring in India and Pakistan. So, whereas Jinnah's independence movement has been vindicated in India by the actions of Modi, where Muslims are fearing for their lives, literally, we're seeing a shift in Pakistan, and that's something that it is our duty to acknowledge and not wipe clear like the proposition has done. For example, there is a Sikh pilgrimage corridor that's been opened by Imran Khan very recently, which openly allows Sikhs to travel from parts of the Punjab in India to parts of the Punjab in Pakistan. If anyone's heard of Gwadar, if you drive from Karachi to Gwadar, you can see a lot of Hindu shrines, which have been in texts, religious texts of Hindus for so many years. And finally, you need to acknowledge that our history, our Sufi history, had shrines of which were not just Muslims. In Karachi, I can name a dozen shrines in which devout Muslims go to again and again, but of course the ironic thing for many of them, and what would be a surprise to many of them, is that they aren't Muslims at all. They're Buddhists, they're Sikhs, they're Hindus. And that's a pluralism which is rich in Pakistan particularly, and that's not something that we should shy away from. So for the sake of our history, for our philosophy, and for our current trajectory, I beg you to support the motion. Thank you.
I now call upon the second speaker of the proposition to deliver a speech.
So when it comes to the theory of nations and nation building, we find that nations ultimately need something that unifies them together. In the words of French sociologist Durkheim, he says that the totality of beliefs and sentiments common to the average members of a society forms a determinate system with a life of its own. This can be termed as a collective or common consciousness. In Pakistan, what exactly is this common consciousness? It's a very diverse country with many different groups from different backgrounds. And I'm trying to argue is the fact that our main common denominator is in fact Islam. After all, this is the foundation upon which Pakistan was built upon. But does that still hold up to this very day? Let's see. Firstly, Pakistan is a country which struggles to communicate with one another effectively. We all speak very different languages. The most common language in Pakistan is Punjabi. Punjabi is spoken by 44% of the population. However, the official language of Pakistan, Urdu, is only spoken by 7.5% of the population. How can a country which is barely able to understand one another coherently be able to unify with one another? Additionally to this, we are also quite ethnically diverse. We are split across many lines, but Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, up north. Sorry. And we live in a nation where, oddly, we often put our regional identity ahead of our national identity. We're often proud to say, yeah, you know, I'm from Sindh, rather than saying, yeah, I'm from Pakistan. And this has seen the rise of many separatist movements in Pakistan. For example, we had the Balochi separatist movement, or we have the Sindhi separatist movement. And even last year as well, we saw the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement have their long march across Pakistan demanding equal rights for the people of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and northern Balochistan. And this is a movement that can, in theory, also become an independence movement. When Pakistan was formed, the reason these regions were chosen to form the foundations of Pakistan is due to their strong Islamic heritage, and this is seen as what would hold us together in the future. One counter-argument you could say to this is education. You know, we already know that Pakistan already has a fundamentally flawed education system. And you know, if we improve this, it will help things get better. But in practice, forced cohesion doesn't work. Pakistan tried it itself. For example, look at the project of East Pakistan, Bangladesh. Bangladesh, we tried to make Urdu the official language there. But look what happened. They were quite unhappy, and this caused a lot of unrest in future years, and due to this, within 20 years, Bangladesh seceded. And look at present day as well, where we've seen China, where the Uyghur people are being locked up in internment camps, being told to renounce their faith, and being told to believe in the Chinese constitution against their will. Is this what you truly want to see as a potential alternative to forcing people to believe in a certain manner? One common criticism of Imran Khan when he got elected is that, oh, he panders too much to Islam right, he panders too much to extremists. Which in essence, but what, you can ask, why is he doing so? He knows it because this is what's going to gain him votes, essentially. He knows this is what Pakistani people essentially believe is most important to them, religion. And to end my opening remark, I just end upon why I decided to speak today. Even though, like, I was born in England, I never lived in Pakistan, I essentially feel more Pakistani than British. And it's weird because, even though being brought up here, I always feel like a stranger in my own country. Yeah, what is it that associates me with Pakistan? I was born here, my mother wasn't, my grandparents weren't even born there either. They were born and was in modern-day India. However, my parents, I've spoken to many times about their stories about crossing the border during the partition and the sacrifice in which they made. And they believed in the project of Pakistan, a nation that's created to protect minorities as well as Muslims to enable them to thrive. And as a result, this has shaped me into the person I am today. And to use the same Shashi Fahora quote from before, you know, to remember where you became from. And this is ultimately where you come from. You can't deny this. You can't rewrite your history. The history of Pakistan is built upon Islam and a nation for Islam. And that's something we can't deny. Hence, I urge you to agree with the proposition. Thanks.
I thank the second speaker for his speech. I now call upon the second speaker of the opposition to deliver her speech.
When Mahesh Malani, a Hindu Pakistani, was elected to the National Assembly in Pakistan in 2018 was when I really noted the number of Pakistanis who do not associate themselves with Islam but still subscribe to a Pakistani identity. To me, this proves that the two things are not inseparable. Two things in my speech then. Firstly, I'm going to prove to you that there is a generational divide. That is to say that the younger Pakistani generation do not necessarily agree that Islam is a prerequisite to their Pakistani identity. Secondly, I'm going to prove that non-Muslims in Pakistan not only accept but embrace a Pakistani identity, and this is evidence that Islam is not fundamental to it. But firstly, a bit of rebuttal. So what did we hear from side proposition? They told us that 97% of Pakistanis are Muslims, and this shows that Islam is fundamental to a Pakistani identity. Note, though, that this motion says Pakistani identity. You can have a Pakistani identity outside of Pakistan. There are people across the globe who are Pakistani but do not necessarily ascribe to Islam. And so this shows that identity and Pakistani identity can be based on culture and not religion, which is evident across the globe. And so you can be Pakistani and not be Muslim. Secondly, they told you that the Pakistani forefathers created Pakistan for Muslims. But what the proposition missed out and didn't tell you was that Muhammad al-Jinnah actually perpetuated a secular vision too. He told you that in Pakistan you can go to your temples, you can go to your churches. It's in Islam that there should be no compulsion in religion. And so we say that you can be non-Muslim and live in Pakistan because that happens today. That's what Muhammad al-Jinnah said that you can do. So they didn't tell you the full story. And then lastly, they told you that there's this common consciousness and this is Islam, and we should allow this to happen in Pakistan. I tell you that identity is not collective, it's actually personal. There is no common consciousness that brings Pakistanis together in the form of religion, it's actually culture. We tell you that common consciousness is actually problematic. You see this in the UK when they try and tell you that like if you don't propose these BMEs and take them out of the UK and put them in Europe, like you're a minority. We tell you that common consciousness is tyranny of the majority, it shouldn't happen. It's problematic for individuals who want to transgress the norm. So on that note, we've told you that the historical vision of Pakistan actually accommodates for secularism, and secondly, that people don't actually think that their Pakistani identity is dependent on Islam. It's actually other things like culture. So on to my first substantive then. The proposition try and paint out the status quo is that everyone accepts Islam as necessary for Pakistani identity. This is a false narrative, given the continuously growing secular movement which is happening amongst the younger Pakistani generation. Some older Pakistanis, who align themselves more to dogmatic religious principles, may agree with the proposition. Yet this is not an accepted norm amongst the whole Pakistani community, or even by most Pakistanis. Note that this motion, as I said, allows us to look at Pakistanis across the globe and not just in Pakistan. So note that there is a growing global secular movement amongst younger Pakistanis. That is to say that they do not feel attached to Islam in the slightest. To them, a Pakistani identity is more about culture, their language, food, and they embrace this. They think that's what makes them Pakistani. In practice, the growing secularization looks like Pakistanis who engage in things which Islam forbids, such as the consumption of alcohol or eating food that is not halal, etc. You may now be thinking that if they didn't approve of Islam, why have they not just left the religion? To this I would say, imagine you're a Pakistani now in your teens who was told from a young age that by your parents and your elders that you have to be Muslim in order to be accepted in this Pakistani community. As that male teen, you would feel as if you cannot opt out of this religion due to the backlash from the elders in that community. That's probably the reason why they tend to hide their Facebook posts of them drinking, because they're afraid their Pakistani aunties and uncles will see them. So even if you are part of the large group of younger Pakistanis, you may not feel comfortable to overtly oppose Islam because of the generational divide that exists. And when they tell you that 90% of Pakistanis are Muslim, that's probably why. It's probably because they don't feel like they can opt out, but they want to opt out. There has already been some progress for these young people who can opt out of their religion, proving that this is not an accepted norm that you have to be Muslim to be Pakistani. But once this generational divide is completely eradicated, it will become easier for them to disassociate themselves from Islam in the public domain. So just because a secular movement hasn't been spoken about in mainstream discourse or from politicians in Pakistan, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Given that it evidently does exist, proves that Pakistanis are now moving towards not associating themselves with Islam, but still retaining a Pakistani identity through the appeal of the culture, the food, dress, religion that makes Pakistan so distinct. And so, it is not an accepted norm that Pakistani identity is dependent on a belief in Islam. On to my second substantive then. Christians and Hindus exist in Pakistan and subscribe to Pakistani culture and heritage, but not to Islam. For them too, Pakistani identity is based on culture and not religion. There are some non-Muslims in Pakistan that feel targeted by blasphemy laws and leave the country to settle in places like Canada and Australia. The key thing here to note, though, is that they still feel Pakistani. They still ascribe to a Pakistani identity because for them, they separate their national identity and their religion. Christians in Pakistan will still embrace their Pakistani identity through the way that they dress, the language that they speak, their historical ties to the land, etc. And these things don't cease to exist when they move countries. Because for them, as I said, Pakistani identity has nothing to do with religion, but it's solely dependent on culture. This is evidence that you can feel and be Pakistani without having to be Muslim, just as Christians and Hindus in Pakistan do. If you agree with side proposition today, you would have to concede that a belief in Islam is a prerequisite to a Pakistani identity in all circumstances. In contrast, I have proved that firstly, not all of the Pakistani community accept this, given the secular movement amongst Pakistanis is growing. Secondly, there exist people from other religions who adopt and embrace a Pakistani identity who are not Muslim. Both of these things prove that they can and is a Pakistani identity without Islam, and so I am more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for her speech. I now call upon the third speaker of the proposition to deliver her speech. Before we start, can I remind if people are leaving to close the door quietly?
I think the opposition lays a great amount of focus on minorities, but at the end of their speeches, it is unclear to me why the Islamic identity harms the identity of minorities when Islam, in fact, actively upholds their identity and their rights. I think in the case of minorities, the blasphemy laws have been the most contentious. However, its opponents do not argue that a religion-inspired law has no place in our society, but rather that the law is contradictory to the spirit of Islam or the principles of Islam. So I suppose to weave arguments around secularism are counterproductive as far as at least blasphemy laws are concerned, for instance. So I think that because the proper rulings are not applied, for instance, in the case of blasphemy laws, like punishment by death, if you properly apply the Islamic principle, would be like the absolute last resort, right? You would have like higher barriers to like testimony. Not anyone can just give a testimony against a minority. You will look at things like, is this person just, or is this person somehow a business partner to this person, or things such as, are people from the same family, you know, testifying against that person? I think then the individual would be like suitably interrogated. I think Islam, and because it actively upholds minorities, would be in fact the only thing in Pakistan protecting them. I think secondly, recognize that all other ideologies have massively failed also, right? I think whether these be like capitalist, democratic, socialist, I mean, any of them. I think when you look at, for instance, the UK and the US, you have like minorities that are like actively like demonized under the label of immigrants. I think the rise of Islamophobia has been extremely rampant within these countries. Socialism has largely failed in protecting like people or minorities for that matter. If you have the case, for instance, China, where you have Muslims that are actively like indoctrinated to like give up their faith and then align with like Chinese ideologies. You have like democracies run by Nobel Peace Prize laureates, for instance, like in Burma, like where the Rohingya Muslims are like actively like ethnically cleansed, right? I think an example that's like closer to home would be like India, which is one of the largest democracies in the world, where you have like 20% of minorities, a figure that probably would not be considered minority in many cases, but where minorities are like actively oppressed. I think that figure versus the 3% that you have in Pakistan goes to show like a very stark comparative about how these ideologies have largely failed in like actually protecting their minorities and the kind of ideologies that possibly like opposition is trying to bring to you.
For information.
No, thank you. I think secondly then, the rise of extremism or far right is also because of the lack of implementation of what people of Pakistan conceive to be appropriate or like proper Islamic practices. I think recognize the fact that like Daniel properly gave you the explanation of what an identity even is in the case of Pakistan, at a point at which where the emotions and thoughts of people are like separate from what they're expecting people to imply within Pakistan is where friction is created, right? I think on the onset of Pakistan, the public was like fed with the idea that the creation of Pakistan was for the implementation of Islamic law. I think that when the system comes down to like policies, when the system and the policies come down to whims of those that are in rule-making processes and like you have manufactured consent, is a point at which like extremism, mob violence, and vigilantism actually rise. I think because people largely then fail to actually trust the state with the rules that it's implementing. I think the case prominent in this case would be the case of Asia Noreen, and I'm not sure how many people of you know about this, but this was a Christian girl who was in a historical ruling by the Supreme Court last year acquitted of the blasphemy law that was initially charged against her. I think this is a one-off like miracle ruling. I think the reason people actually took to the streets, or the far right actually took to the streets, was because they actually did not understand where this ruling had come from, because the Supreme Court does not normally do these kind of rulings, right? I think this was the only point in the history where they had actually used like hadith and Quran to actually like say, no, this girl is like, she's not like, she's not committed blasphemy. I think that's why people took to the streets at the point in which this is like a norm and people actually trust the state to be using proper Islamic practices, at the point in which they will no longer take to the streets. But like secondly, I think it's very important for like this reason is the fact that like even if in this case where like Islam was like narrowly implemented, is the only case in which you have this case where like this girl was like said to not have committed blasphemy. I think this is a great testament of how even when in the cases where Islam is like narrowly applied, you have minorities that are protected, and like largely the people in a majority of the people in Pakistan actually did support this decision. Thirdly, then recognize that there's no other alternative to the Islamic identity for Pakistan, because like secularization or the secular approach is not going to work for Pakistan for like several reasons. I think Daniel lays out to you how this was like reason for formation of Pakistan. I think it's going to be contradictory, almost like a logical fallacy, in the case that if you say that you can separate Islamic identity from Pakistan. I think because Pakistan was literally the only other case in modern history other than Israel of religious nationalism, I think it would not sit well with most of you if I told you like separate Israel from like, for instance, Judaism. I think therefore like secularization, which is like a process of you rationally losing your faith, I think cannot be like true in the case of Pakistan. Because Jinnah, who was even, for instance, liberal-minded, as like the opposition says, was in fact like he actively advocated the two-nation theory, right? He did say that, for instance, that the flag of Islam is the Muslim League flag, or that he's quoted to have said that you cannot separate Muslim League from Islam. No material or like influential institution within Pakistan is secular, not our establishment or even liberal like parties, they're not even secular. I think every political party seeks what its voter base wants. Even Pakistan People's Party, for instance, is a supposedly liberal party and a secular one, was a party that actually instated the 1973 constitution, which actually made Islam as the main religion of Islam and like definition of what a Muslim is in the constitution. I think ideologically, even our armed forces are geared to uphold Islamic values in terms of their orientation and identity. I think a case can be even made for like Imran Khan, who literally in every single speech of his, in his campaign speech, said that I want to like create a Pakistan which is like similar to the Riyasat, the state of Medina, right? I think people voted for him then in like droves. I think ultimately what it comes down to is the fact that like Islam can be the only threat creating national identity in a state otherwise like divided by along like ethnic, provincial, cultural, religious, or like linguistic lines, right? I think that this is exactly why when you have like recognize the fact that when you have like 58% of the population that is illiterate, cannot even like write their name down, but like have an understanding of the key principles of Islam, is the only reason why they understand that like regardless of your skin color or your face, you're like all equal. This is the reason they actually like take to the streets to protest against like Rohingya, like Muslims that are being ethnically cleansed. Like I think this is the kind of like sense of belonging, this greater identity that does not exist anywhere else. This is also the case for minorities, right? Because Islam actively upholds their rights, it's unclear to me that why, when they are like not Muslim, they can still be Pakistani. I think because it's like your Islamic identity also upholds your identity as a minority, I don't think that you can separate the two. I think for all these reasons, the motion clearly stands. Thank you so much.
I thank the third speaker for her speech. I now call upon the final speaker of the conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot today from both sides that competes primarily, I feel, over three main areas, three sort of points of clash, in which the two sides can't seem to agree. But it seems to me that side government really fails to understand their own, the own sort of assumptions they're making, the own arguments they're making, what they imply about the nature of Pakistan, and what the future of Pakistan looks like. So the first point of clash that we see is what composes a national identity. What is a national identity made up of? The first speaker for the government side suggested it's this split between what the government does and between the sort of thoughts and emotions of the people. Now, the first government speaker is immediately undermined in his own statistic. He suggested that 97% of people in Pakistan are Muslim, and therefore Pakistan is Muslim. The thoughts and emotions of people in Pakistan are Muslim. Pakistan is the fourth most, the nation, the fourth largest nation on earth in our population counts. So the 3% of the population that aren't Muslim count for some 6.4 million people. So in assuming that because 97% of Pakistan is Islamic, that therefore Pakistan as a country has to be Muslim, and that the thoughts and emotions of all the people of Pakistan are Muslim, he's eliminating those 6.4 million people who have Pakistani passports, who identify as Pakistani, who live in Pakistan. He's eliminating them from the thoughts and concerns of how we should consider the Pakistani identity. So instantly from side government we see a sort of problematic approach to the idea of what Pakistan is and who Pakistanis are. So this division between sort of the thoughts and emotions of the people and the sort of policy of the government is something we see come out repeatedly on side government, and it's something that they disagree with each other about. The first speaker suggests that the thoughts and emotions are for Islam, and that the problem is that the government isn't ruling in line with Islam, and that's why there is conflict. Whereas the last speaker suggests, in the case of Asia, that this woman who's been on death row for 8 years on charge of blasphemy and was finally acquitted recently, has suggested that the riots against that decision, the riots against the sort of her acquittal, are because the people don't understand Islamic law that's being defined by the government. So which side, which is the side government thinks? Does it think that the government is actually making a positive ruling in line with Islamic law? Or do they think that the government is not making a ruling in line with Islamic law, and that's why there is this friction and conflict? It doesn't seem clear from side government. So from side opposition, we've had a much more cohesive and coherent case as to why Pakistan, this nation with these 6.4 non-Muslim people who identify as Pakistani, why identifying the sort of Pakistani identity as purely Muslim is a very sort of limited and indeed historic viewpoint. So the second point of clash that we see is what the history of Pakistan says, what historically has Pakistan been. We've had disagreements about how Jinnah, his sort of viewpoint as to what the Pakistani nation should be, and ultimately, side opposition has to argue that it doesn't really matter. Historically speaking, whatever the origins of Pakistan may be, what really matters are the people who live in Pakistan at the moment. So the idea that we should define what a nation's identity is, a nation that currently exists, whose people are sort of sitting around this room right now, the idea that we should define that country based on history doesn't seem to make much sense. It is a side note that side opposition is entirely correct in pointing out that Jinnah in fact intended for Pakistan to be a country of pluralism and a country where multiple religions are welcome, and ultimately that's a much more positive view of Pakistan than was presented by side government, where those 6.4 million don't count or don't matter or are not Pakistani. So the third sort of point of clash is, how does modern Pakistan exist and where is it going? what's going to happen in the future. And this is where I think the meat of the debate lies, in what do people around this room as Pakistanis, what do people living in Pakistan, and what are the sort of Pakistani diaspora around the world, people who've left Pakistan just to identify with a label. What do they think about the Pakistani identity? What do they identify Pakistan with? And ultimately what we see from side opposition is a very sensible argument that ultimately, for young people at least, it's not primarily about religion solely. And that ultimately, Western culture is something that people are engaging with. So all over, for instance, in London, this very city, there's a colossal Pakistani population who will go and eat Pakistani food, they wear Pakistani clothing, but they will also do things that are traditionally Western. And this fusion of culture is something that happens wherever people from different countries move around the world. Now, the only sort of conclusion we can draw from side government's case, that Pakistani identity is based entirely upon religious grounds, is that these people who have left Pakistan and who are taking part in activities that are Western or might not align with Sharia law, these people must be struck off. They cannot be called Pakistani, they cannot be described as Pakistani. And ultimately, it's such a short-sighted vision of what Pakistan can be and what Pakistan could be. It's an idea that means that people's children, if they choose to go abroad to gain the benefits of universities in England, for instance, if you travel here and you have your mind changed, you decide, for instance, that you would prefer to drink alcohol versus not. If you go to be educated in a subject and you change your mind about something that most Muslim people, for instance, think a different way about, if any of those points that you've drawn out of this great opportunity you've taken to go around the world, to visit these other places and to learn from them, if you decide that, to change your mind there on something that your parents, for instance, disagree with, who might remain in Pakistan, so government would argue you are no longer Pakistani. You no longer have that link to Pakistan, you cannot be considered a member of the national body at all. And so the ultimate question of what modern Pakistan exists as, who we should consider Pakistani, has to come back to the points that the second opposition speaker made. That ultimately there's a generational divide about what people see Pakistan as, but that whether people identify as Muslims or not, and whether people from sort of Pakistani families partake in sort of Muslim style sort of lifestyles or not, they still identify as Pakistani, and this is a very, very good thing. If people are ultimately identifying with their families, identifying with their history, identifying with their culture, identifying with the sort of food and dress that might be associated with Pakistani things, that's fantastic, that's brilliant. What we definitely do not want to advocate for any Pakistani people is that they cannot belong, they cannot be a part of the nation because they don't agree with a strict, specific religious definition. So because Thai government refuses to engage with questions of sect, with questions of the 6.4 million non-Islamic Pakistani people, and with the key point that around the world, a lot of people who we meet who identify as Pakistani aren't necessarily aligning with their very, very narrow view of what Pakistanis are and what they can be, ultimately you have to reject this motion. Thank you.
So before we go on with the question and answer session, I'd like everyone to join me in giving a huge round of applause. So as we're running out of time, we're going to have to cut the question and answer session a bit down. So I'd encourage people to keep their questions short, concise, and specifically, you have to address them to either side. So either proposition or opposition. Yes?
I would like to ask a question to opposition side. I think they propose that secular pluralism can be better identity for Pakistan to protect ethnic and religious minorities. My question would be that you can see in India, which is a secular pluralistic country, 20% Muslims, they are under the tyranny of majority. So for example, Hindus are not allowed to eat beef, and in more than 20 states, beef transportation is even illegal for Muslims. While under Islamic law and Islamic identity, alcohol is not allowed, haram for Muslims, while Islamic law give a right to non-Muslims to actually consume alcohol. Also, you can see, Islamic identity and Islamic system protect the property rights and culture of religious minorities, and that's why from the history we can see that these non-Muslims, they always take pride in living in Muslim lands and adopting Islamic identity because it safeguards their rights better than secular pluralism, which we can see in India or in the Western world, which is the tyranny of majority. I cannot actually in Britain solve my family disputes according to my customs or according to my belief system. This is secular pluralism. While if you live in a Muslim country as a religious minority under Islamic system, you can address your customs, problems, family laws according to your system. We learn from the state of Medina when Prophet ﷺ has the first constitution. He gave rights to Jews to settle their disputes according to their cultural values. Now, that's where I think you need to be very clear to the audience to put your opposition that you propose secular pluralism to protect religious minorities, while the history and the examples contemporary clearly explain that that is not the right approach or the right thing.
I'd encourage audience members to please keep questions concise. We can go through the entire attendees. Opposition free to respond.
So there are two things I'd like to say to that. The first of which is a point of agreement. I don't think anyone is going to stand here and say that India has lived up to its secular, pluralistic ideals. No one is saying that. In fact, Modi was banned from traveling to various countries and he's now running the show. So let me start off by that. But linked to that is I think we really need to get away from a compare and contrast with India. Our identity is not defined by not being Indian. And what that links to is I agree wholeheartedly with the vision that you outlined for Islam. Let's say, in theory, I absolutely agree with what you did. The truth of the matter is, since Medina Riyasat, we have not seen Medina Riyasat. And if you are going to stand there and say that Pakistan is living up to those ideals, I'll be the first to object to that. So if we were living in that sort of pluralist society, then ironically, then this debate would be won by us. Because of course, having Islamic law, having that plural society means that Muslims, Jews, Christians, non-Muslims as well, are able to live in peace and to live in a symbiotic society. But sadly, that's not the case, and that's exactly what we're arguing.
You want me to respond?
Yeah, sorry, only one question. Yes?
Yeah, hi. I have two questions for team composition. First, so the first speaker of proposition stood up and said that actually, without Islam, there is no Pakistani identity because Islam is so unifying between all Pakistanis. But that's not actually true. I mean, we didn't hear any explanation of how, Islam can also be divisive. And, we see this throughout sectarianism. So what kind of conception of Islam are proposition proposing? Are they saying Shia Islam? Are they saying Sunni Islam? Are they saying the Ahmadi Islam? And, in fact, we think that I personally think that undermines a lot of their claim. And I asked the proposition to respond to that. Second thing I have to ask is that, to me at least, I don't feel convinced, and I don't think proposition fulfilled the burden that was, at least to me, imminent on them today, in that they had to prove that, Islam is the sole component, overriding component that constitutes Pakistan's identity, and that if you remove Islam, there is nothing else that defines Pakistanis. Is proposition really saying that without Islam, no Pakistani can identify with the culture, the music, the weddings that we have, or the music that we listen to? And, to me, at least, I want team proposition to respond to how Islam is the most important factor of that.
First point is regards to there being different sects in Islam and people having different interpretations. But not everything is subjective. There are core principles and fundamentals in Islam that everyone ascribes to in Islam. And that is quite clear-cut, otherwise everything would just be open for interpretation, everything would be subjective. And one thing that you see, for instance, one example, if you go on Hajj, you see all the Muslims, millions and millions all come together, all under this one proponent of La ilaha illallah, shahada. So there is a unifying factor amongst Muslims, and it's not all open to interpretation. The second thing, which is that every society needs some set of unifying factor. All politicians and academics in their works show this, that no way can society come together with no unifying factor. And the fact is as Akmal made a very good point, is that Pakistan has many, many different of these cultures and identities within it. And frankly, music is not going to unite a whole population together. So, yeah.
Yeah, and on to that point as well, you talk about all this cultural stuff. Many of us who share India as well. Like, when I ask you the question, what differentiates Pakistan from India, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Islam. That's the foundation of it, and that's something you can't escape. Even when I renounce my faith today, I say, I'm an atheist now, I can't escape the fact, that's the foundation on which I was built upon. Remember where you came from? And also, in addition to that, again, what the opposition have failed to present to me is that they've not given me an alternative to a unifying factor. You said they've not provided something that, so we don't speak the same language, we all have different regional identities. They haven't told me anything that will overcome this. And in secularism, like, why don't it all just secede? Why don't we just have like a separate nations within Pakistan that is not under this Pakistani identity? And that's not been expressed today.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
For the opposition, we heard a lot about, in various different arguments, about how if Islam was to become the main core part of Pakistani identity, that would exclude, the 30% millions of non-Muslim Pakistanis, and that's why it wouldn't be a unifying factor. But that doesn't really make sense. Why does having a unifying factor in a country exclude those who don't subscribe directly to it? You can still live under it within harmony. I mean, why should if we live in a secular country today, but people who are devoutly religious can still subscribe to have the British identity, even though they're at direct odds with the core unifying factor, potentially. So I don't really buy this argument.
I suppose the sort of key argument we're hearing from the side proposition here is the idea you have to have this single unifying factor, it has to unify a country. But frankly, it's ridiculous. If you look at the nation of Switzerland, for instance, it's divided geographically, linguistically, and religiously, and yet somehow it holds together into a state that everyone agrees is a state. It's not sort of riven by civil war. There aren't people constantly seceding from Switzerland. So the idea you have to have this single unifying factor in order for a state to exist is a ridiculous assertion. We've had nothing to back it up from side proposition. And so the idea we have to provide a unifying factor other than religion, like music, that might be unify Pakistan, doesn't make any sense to side opposition at all. The key point is religion is not a unifying factor for Pakistan. It doesn't unify all Pakistanis. Pakistanis exist who are not religiously unified, and therefore it cannot be considered the sort of root to Pakistani identity.
I think the biggest example of what you just said is 1971. If the idea that Islam could unify populations 2,000 miles apart was the case, then why did Bangladesh leave us? It's because of atrocities that weren't overcomable by just the mere commonality of religion. You need to realize that the idea of Pakistan being being solely unified by Islam was disproven in 1971 by our own actions, because the idea that we have more in common with people 2,000 miles away from us rather than the Punjabis next door in India, frankly, it's open for discussion. Do we really?
Yes?
So I have a question for the proposition. So you say that Pakistan has a unifying factor, which is Islam. Now, I feel like Pakistan has failed to protect minorities. As a Shia Muslim, members of my own family had been killed. So when I look at Pakistan, I see Islam as a different factor. I look at Pakistan and I, see its culture and stuff. So because I can't identify with the Islam that is proposed within the state. So how would you react to that? How would you say that that is still a unifying factor?
So I think firstly, like Shias and Sunnis, all of these categories fall under the banner of Islam. So all of these people are in fact Muslims. And then you do, for instance, fall under the Islamic banner. But I think ultimately the fact that proper Islamic practices are not even being used in the case of minorities, let alone Muslims, is the point at which you have this friction that we did talk about. I think at the point at which you specifically start doing the right thing for everyone within your own country, that you do not leave it to few people who are in power and they choose what to do with that kind of power that they have, and you actually say, look, this is what our nation is, this is what we're meant to do, this is my right to protect the people that are within it, whether you're a minority, whether you're a Muslim, regardless of your sect or your religion, even you could be an atheist for that matter. I think that at the point which you actually properly implement those things is the point at which you're protecting everyone within that country. I think that because it's not happening currently is the reason why you have this kind of friction or the kind of things that do happen within that violence that does take place.
Any other? Yes.
I think the opposition has misunderstood the whole concept of tolerance.
So your questions?
Yes, so it's good to get towards the opposition. I think they, if you look at Voltaire's Treaty on Tolerance, he was referring to the Ottomans and in terms of the tolerance that they implemented, because the various Christian sects used to migrate to the Ottoman land for security, and the Jews as well. So that even Theodor Herzl, who wanted a homeland for the Jews, went to the Ottomans seeking that because of the persecution of. So I don't see where you get any evidence for any intolerance under Islam. Because under the Sharia of Islam, you find even today the most holiest church, the keys of that is in the hands of the Muslims, because administering the various sects within how they administer the church. So I think historically there's so much ample evidence from Jewish historians, from Christian historians, from all historians identifying the tolerance of Islam and how Islam was tolerant. And so historically we are incorrect on that. And also the whole notion of the vision of Pakistan has never been fulfilled. So if you look at the creation of New Banidam by I think it's Venkat Dulipali or some, I don't know, Venkat Dulipali. If you read his book, he actually details the true vision of Pakistan, which was never fulfilled, and Jinnah's statement in the Lahore Declaration. So I think, I'm not sure where you're getting any evidence about the intolerance of Islam. In fact, history demonstrates that tolerance was under Islam, and Pakistan is not implementing Islam today. That's the problem.
I think we need to take a step back from saying that, because I agree with you, if Islam was exercised in the way that it should be and tolerant in the way that it should by Pakistani politicians, I would definitely agree with you. But the fact of the matter is, there used to be 17% of non-Muslims in Pakistan, but they left because they did feel targeted by blasphemy laws. They felt like they were literally being targeted by it, and so that's why they left. So I think that because of the fact that in Pakistan, Islam isn't being exercised in the tolerant way that it should be, it shouldn't be a unifying factor, like they said, of Pakistani identity, because of how Pakistanis are invalidating the way that it should be exercised. And so I don't think that it can be a unifying factor because of the way that it's being exercised in Pakistan today, and I don't even think it should be.
I think the key second point there is I think you slightly misunderstood their argument, because not arguing that Islam is inherently sort of exclusionary of other groups, and that was an argument, in fact, the government is making, that ultimately the other people in Pakistan don't matter, they don't count. Our whole argument is that Pakistanis who don't want Muslim are equally Pakistani. They count equally as Pakistani people, and their Pakistani identity can't be found on religious grounds. It can't be the sole thing that defines you as Pakistani. So ultimately, as the first speaker mentioned in reply to another question, if that vision is fulfilled, our side wins, because you have Pakistani people who live in Pakistan, identify Pakistani, who are not Muslim, who are tolerant.
I mean, to be honest, I do take objection to your question, because essentially what Jewish historians wrote in the 16th century about Suleiman the Magnificent really doesn't say much about Zardari or Nawaz Sharif today. The implementation of policies in Pakistan has been discriminatory, has been exclusionary, and like you yourself said, has not lived up to the ideals that Islam, and we're the first to say that it hasn't lived up to these ideals.
But also the fact that if Islam does cater to these minorities, it doesn't mean that it has to be part of their identity. They can still accept that they live in this place, but their identity is fueled more on culture and not religion. So Islam might be what the state is using Sharia law, but it doesn't have to be part of their identity. Their identity is based on culture and not religion.
Any other? Yes?
So this question is to the proposition, and I was wondering...
Sorry, could you speak up a little?
This question is for the proposition, and my question is, if you would draw a parallel view to that of India, and if you would apply the same argument that without Islam there can't be a Pakistani identity, would you say that without Hinduism there can't be an Indian identity?
I think there's a fundamental difference between India and Pakistan you need to look at. Firstly, the fact that when India was established, Pakistan took a while to get the groundwork up. The Muslim League, they took 20 years to hold the first election. And by that time, 20 years as a whole generation of people in order to set up this sort of structural inequality that has sort of been left to this very day. Whereas you look at India, they were very quick to have their elections initially, and this was quite easy to establish this sort of separation of state and religion and allow nothing to happen in between. So with India, it's slightly different in that regard.
I'd like to add that if we're comparing Hinduism and Islam, Islam is, as I said in my speech, a comprehensive way of life. It has an economic system, political system, social system, and it has accountability, which ensures that this will be implemented in, and this history has even shown us that it existed in the region, and Muslims, Christians, Hindus all lived peacefully together under the system, whereas Hinduism just simply doesn't have this, and it's left for any individual to rule by what they want.
Also, I think in addition to that, India was not created for the basis of Hinduism, right? I think Pakistan was the only reason it was created was a two-nation theory, and that idea then came about, and therefore you created this nation that you wanted for the purposes of protection of Muslims within it. I think that India never advocated that we want a separate nation because we want Hindus, because Hindus were largely in majority anyway. I think it was for the Muslims. I think that because it's the only other case of religious nationalism, I think that does not, I think the parallel does not draw to India.
I'd just like to remind speakers that the motion we're looking at is in regards to identity, so we're not really looking at comparing religions together. Just take that into mind. Yes, person at that.
Right, so I went to a Catholic school in Pakistan, and my principal was one of the most decorated Christian Air Force pilots in the country. So he fought the 1965 war, fought the 1971 war. I'm not sure which identity he fought for, whether it was Islam or Pakistani. Because when we heard of Islam, it's unlikely because he was a very staunch Christian and a very staunch nationalist.
Your side is to proposition. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So, I mean, essentially, if there's a Christian officer serving in the military of Pakistan, which identity is he fighting for or has fought for in the past?
Not asking.
Well, clearly not Islam, right?
But he is fighting for a Pakistani identity, right? In that case. But what is a Pakistani identity? That's the point we're trying to
Clearly
get
cannot
at.
be Islam for him, right?
So the question is focusing, isn't there a contradiction between the teacher? Is he a Christian or is
I mean, if we look into the past and Muslim nations and origins and whatnot, when Christians or Hindus could also fought alongside Muslims too, because they knew that Islam would protect them, and because they knew that Islam would protect them as it did, they would fight amongst Muslims because they wanted to remain with the protection that Islam wanted.
Yes. Hi there, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. I think my question is directed at the opposition. I think there's a misunderstanding that seems to have occurred between the kind of either side, given that, frankly speaking, the wording of the motion is slightly
Could you
poor.
keep it concise
So
so
in
we can
terms-
have
sure,
one
sure.
more
So
question?
in terms of the issue, I think you guys are viewing identity purely from the individual sense. Society is not just composed of individuals. It's composed of emotions, it's composed of ideas, fundamentally it's composed of relationships, all based upon and centered around a state. Can't talk about this room as being not a society. We're a society in this room based on common ideas and discussions, yet we heavily disagree. I think every single historical example you gave, nearly every single one, was under the basis of the states of Islam. You gave the examples of the tolerance, you gave the examples of how people lived together, collaborated, fought together, died together. Non-Muslims and Muslims can still live and be part of a state which is based upon Islam. So that's the kind of point. Secondly, in terms of your blasphemy... No, I'm just saying in terms of the blasphemy laws, please. So in terms of the blasphemy law point, I think you made a fundamental mistake by referencing this case. Because the reason Pakistan's blasphemy law is so unjust is because you have a punishment which comes from Islam, and then you have an evidential law which comes from the English common law system. So you have reasonable basis, reasonable burden of proof, beyond reasonable doubt, and you're applying beyond reasonable doubt for a punishment for which there has to be beyond any doubt. So if you apply Islam's evidential law, as the Supreme Court did in their discussion, you would see that Islam, if properly applied within Pakistan, given that it's the basis of Pakistan, would create the justice that you're talking about is not currently there. That's my point.
I mean, I think you eloquently summarized the problem with potentially Pakistani society today, which is that we are very nostalgic about this golden era that we had, which is right, we should be, but that's a duty for a historian. So we're like an ailing man who looks back towards his youth and thinking, oh, that was great.
Well, the premise of your motion was highly historical examples, so that's why I mentioned it.
No, but the thing that we really need to do is take stock of where we are, and the image and the portrayal of Islam is beautiful that you put forward, but it's just not the case in Pakistan. So no one is arguing, again, no one is arguing against Islam, no one is arguing against the ideals. What we're arguing against is the implementation of so-called Islam, which clearly hasn't come to fruition. If you presented the idea, or if you presented the practical realities of Pakistan today, I would hesitate to find a single scholar who would say that this is Islamic in any measure of the word. That's all we're saying.
Sorry, last question.
That's right, last question.
I have a question for Team Proposition. Doesn't Proposition agree that identity isn't just history, right? So it's actually so much more than history. So no one actually disagrees that Pakistan was founded on a historical religious mandate, but that doesn't actually do anything to support your case of why it should be, looking forward, a singular normatively desirable vision of what the identity of Pakistan and Pakistanis are. And in that sense, there is this huge disconnect from history and a forward-looking vision of the nation and its citizens.
So every nation needs to make laws and govern its society, right? Now the motion says this House believes that without Islam there is no Pakistani identity. And what we try to argue today is that that can only be Islam, because that is what majority of the population believe in, and it's the only comprehensive way of life, as we believe, as Muslims, has solutions to our problems, being from the Creator. And that's the reason why even today, regardless of history, where history shows us it did, but even if history didn't show us it did, as Muslims we would still believe that Islam is the solution, because that's what we believe in, and that's what the majority of the population does too.
So before we move on to the voting of this motion, I'd like to remind everyone that the point of having debates like this and to conduct votes before and after is to see if our attendees change their opinion based on the arguments presented. So when I conduct the vote, I encourage people to think about the arguments that have been made by both sides and on that basis make their vote. So I'd like to begin by first asking everyone who is still supporting the motion or has maybe changed their mind, who supports the motion, please raise their hands up so our committee members can tally up.
That's why the victim will clarify that identity.
Excuse me. I'd like to I'd now like to ask everyone who is against the motion to please raise their hands up. So the House has swung the vote towards the side of the opposition. I thank everyone once again for coming to the debate, and please stay tuned to our Facebook page and social media handles for more events to come. Thank you.